So when we set out to figure out how we were going to show the book of Leviticus, we were like, how do we show the sacrificial system without necessarily using animals and blood? Especially because there's so much more happening that in this shedding of blood and this taking of life that we as 21st century moderns just miss because of our cultural backgrounds. And so, especially as the poem started to take shape, we realized that what we wanted to talk about was light and dark. That's because there's something there that we can understand implicitly as moderns who still live in the age of electricity, where we turn on lights and darkness flees whenever the lights come on. And the thing that we hope is picked up by this use of light and dark that we think is implicit is this. It's that the whole point of the book of Leviticus is that God is trying to make Israel like him. So over and again, you get this famous phrase that's picked up in the New Testament that we must be holy because God is holy, that we must become like him. And so the whole idea of having a dim light bulb that's not lit up, and then whenever you come into the sacrificial system or you get near the presence of God, that light is transferred into your dim bulb and it becomes like God for a short while. But our unholiness, our impurity, our sin ends up dimming the bulb again, taking the likeness of God out of it, the holiness, the purity out of it. And so the whole reason we used light and dark is to show that the system of atonement was all about making us like God, making the dark like light. One of the big reasons darkness needs to become light is so that they can live together, which is a huge part of the book of Leviticus. The whole point of Leviticus is how can we live with God? How can we be in God's presence? And if you know anything at all about light and dark, they don't go together. As soon as light turns on, all the darkness around it goes away. And so darkness cannot live within light by its very nature. And so we must become like light so that we might be with God, so that his light and our light might coexist and might actually overlap and become one. There's this altar that stands in front of this big towering white room that we refer to as the Holy of Holies. And on it is where the sacrifices of Leviticus take place. You have Aaron, the high priest, behind the altar superintending all the sacrifices, and people bring him unlit bulbs. And that is to show their own unholiness, their disconnectedness to God's light. They are darkness, he is light. And Aaron takes their offering of this thing and lays it on the altar, covers it with a cloth, and smashes it. And it's that moment that is supposed to symbolize the bringing of an animal, the laying it on the altar, and taking its life, shedding its blood, taking something that was and making it something that is not. It's a death in a sense. And then after that crushing happens, Aaron reaches down inside the altar and pulls out a new bulb. And this represents new life, new purity, new holiness. And he screws it into the altar, showing that what was taken on top of the altar is kind of transferred into this new bulb. And it's death to life. And as he screws in the new bulb into the socket, the light comes on. He takes it out, the light stays on. And this holiness, this purity that has been bought by this death is transferred to this bulb and given to the individual. And that person can walk away, but eventually their light dies out and it flickers and dies. They are in need of repurification. They need to come and do the sacrificial system all over again. And we thought that lights dimming out is something that we all kind of experience too, that lights just burn out. You have to replace light bulbs. And so you're constantly having to replace light bulbs. And so what a fitting picture for the sacrificial system that constantly had to be revisited. And you had to continually perform all these actions to keep yourself clean, to keep yourself pure, to keep yourself like light, and to be able to enter into God's presence. The big, tall, 12.5-foot white room is the Holy of Holies. We wanted to make it kind of a dichotomy in itself. It's definitely not a historically accurate structure, but what we're trying to do with it is something a little more artistic. We wanted to make it, on one hand, ominous and tall, overshadowing, powerful, intimidating, but on the other hand, beautiful and simple and clean and pure. And that's why we have this, it's tall and like a gaping mouth. It almost forms like a coffin shape. To come near it in an unholy way would be to die. And yet you look at it in and of itself, and it's completely beautiful. It's actually quite a striking piece of architecture and modern art. And we wanted to kind of blend those two things together, because that's what the center of the tabernacle was and is. It's to come near God unclean is terrifying. Our God is a consuming fire, and yet that's where we most want to be. That's where we'll find most satisfaction. That is what is most beautiful, is the presence of God. And so that light stand and the big light bulb in the middle of it is for us is God's presence. That's the illuminating presence of the Holy of Holies that people want to come near to but can't without the right intermediary and system in place. When Jesus comes on the scene, we see that he is the first person to approach the altar with his bulb already lit. And you'll also notice a slight difference. It's not the same bulb that everybody else has. His bulb is an exact image of the bulb in the Holy of Holies. So that communicates two things. One, it communicates that he is the same God from same God, as the famous Trinitarian creed says. And it's also that his light is already lit. He does not need to perform some kind of ritual at the altar to bring light into his existence, because he was already perfect, he was already holy, he was already pure. He brought that into the world himself. I think it's John that says light has come into the world, and yet the darkness has not understood it. And so Jesus brought his own light into the world, and he lays his light already lit on the altar. It did not need to be smashed. It's dark bulbs that need to be smashed in order to get new life. Jesus is already lit. He could have walked right into the presence of God. He could have stayed in the presence of God. He didn't have to come here with his light. He already was like God. He was God himself. And yet this God himself, this light himself, laid his light on the altar and allowed himself to be crushed like everybody else, like the animals, like the sheep and goats and pigeons and rams from Leviticus. He let himself be treated like an animal on the altar of the sacrificial system and smashed what did not need to be smashed, in order to then go into the presence of God himself and bring the light from the Holy of Holies out into the world. So that what we're showing there, when Jesus goes into the Holy of Holies and brings the light out to the world, we're showing what happened at his death. We read in the Gospels that when Jesus died, the veil that covers the tabernacle and or the Holy of Holies ripped in two from top to bottom. And that is an image of the presence of God coming out into the world. What was inaccessible is now accessible through Jesus. And so he brings that light bulb out into the world. And there's no longer a need for people to come to the altar, smash bulbs, get new bulbs over and over and over and over and over again. Instead, what we see in the closing shots of Leviticus is we see Jesus coming to someone with an unlit bulb, with his lit bulb that he earned through his death, and just coming to them and touching them, and immediately their bulb lights up. Because there's no need for a sacrificial system anymore. We just need an encounter with Jesus. And he is the one who makes us like God. He is the one who makes us light.